Hello and welcome to this episode of A Breath of Fresh Air, a show where we take a deep dive into the lives and music of some of the greatest hitmakers of the 60s, 70s and 80s. This week my special guest is the Australian singer-songwriter Don Walker, whose name you may not know, but whose songs you're most likely very familiar with. Don was the main songwriter for one of Australia's favourite bands between the years of 1973 and 83. He's the guy who crafted so many of the hits for his mate Jimmy Barnes to belt out. Songs like this one that put Cold Chisel firmly on the map. There's been so much written about Cold Chisel over the years, but in my chat with Don, I was pretty surprised to learn about their humble beginnings, about Don's incredible personal background, and to hear the story of how it was the band's girlfriends who discovered and insisted they take notice of a very young Michael Hutchence from INXS.
Oh, yes, said the girlfriends, we're sure. What is it about them? And they're like shaking their heads saying, are you not looking at the singer?
Let's get back to that in a little while. I'd like first to introduce you to Don Walker.
Hello, Sandy.
Hello, Don. Welcome to A Breath of Fresh Air.
My pleasure.
Don Walker is considered one of Australia's best songwriters. He was born in rural North Queensland, spending his early childhood on a sugarcane plantation where he became familiar with gospel, blues and swing before he could even talk. He started having piano lessons following his family's move to New South Wales in the mid-50s and subsequently played the organ too. He completed an honours science degree, qualified as a physicist, and then moved to Adelaide, where his musical life began in earnest.
Well, I had done a degree and I had finished off that degree on a Commonwealth cadetship, which means the Commonwealth government pays your way, but then you owe them a few years' work, which is good if you're a physicist because it guarantees you a job. It meant I didn't have to look for a job teaching. There aren't many places that in those days they could employ a physicist in Australia, and one of them was the Weapons Research Establishment in South Australia,
Right.
which is out between Salisbury and Elizabeth, where Jim grew up.
So you knew Jim already?
No, I think he was in high school, or should have been in high school. But I used to, Elizabeth Town Central was where myself and my mates from Weapons Research used to go and have lunch every day. So we didn't see as much gang warfare as Jim indicates, but I'm sure he was running around,
Partaking.
It was close, yeah. So for a few years there, well, for a little while, we're inhabiting the same space without knowing each other.
Of course, the Jim that Don talks about is the now world-renowned singer-songwriter Jimmy Barnes, who was born in Glasgow, Scotland, and emigrated with his family to Australia as a young child. Jim often referred to his childhood environment as a slum of alcohol and violence, saying that his mother had him and his 4 siblings before she was 21. His older brother John became a successful musician as founder and lead singer of the rock band Swanee. John had encouraged and taught his little brother how to sing, and Jimmy got his first break when he was asked to join Cold Chisel at just 16 years old. At the time, Cold Chisel comprised Ted Broniecki on keyboards, Les Kaczmarek on bass guitar, Ian Moss on guitar and vocals, Steve Prestwich on drums, and Don Walker on piano.
The guy who got Cold Chisel together, Les Kaczmarek, he got Ian and I in the band. And then, according to Jim recently, he was the next one. We're looking around for a singer. I knew Swanee. I had known Swanee for some years.
Who was Jimmy's brother?
Yeah, Swanee and I are the same age. Swanee was an electric singer, incredible singer and frontman. And, somebody that I had and have a lot of time for. We thought we were looking around for a singer, and this is John's young brother. Cold Chisel in the beginning was a random cover band, just doing the songs of the bands that we loved. We tried writing some new songs, not only me, But the earliest songs for the band were written by not only by me, but by John Swan, who was in the band for a little while, and Steve Prestwich. I think they cooked up a song together. That's when the band was in Armidale. In Cold Chisel, the other guys dropped off for a little while, although they were always, keeping the toe in the water. I mean, the first song on the first Cold Chisel album is a song where I wrote some lyrics and Jim took them and wrote the music. And the second album's got a couple of co-writes on it. When Cold Chisel got together, I was a little bit older than the other guys by a couple of years, but that stuff seems important when you're that young. And I guess I'd travelled a bit around the place, and I really wanted us to play original music, and so did the other guys. And so I started trying to write it, and I wrote a lot of bad songs before some okay ones started to come along.
John took on the job as Cold Chisel's main songwriter from that point on.
It was never discussed. It was something that I was very interested in as a discipline, and they were interested in what I was doing. And that was kicked off very early in the band. I wrote a song called "Let Me Not Forget Me," which became I rewrote the lyrics later, and it became "The Party's Over." This was like a jazz ballad, and the band looked at that and thought, "Oh, gee, this is all right. He can do this." So that's what led me to our mutual thing of, I'm going to be writing songs, even though I haven't written many, and they're going to be receptive to that.
Well, it worked out pretty well, didn't it? You had a lot of massive hits.
Songwriting is not necessarily something that you're born to. I'm sure some people are. I found it's just something that if you're fascinated with and you think about a lot and you spend long enough at it, you start to get reasonably handy at it.
What was your process for songwriting? Where did you draw inspiration?
Well, I liked the music I was listening to and I was passionate about it. And I thought, I can do that too.
But you were self-taught as a songwriter.
Yeah, nobody taught me how to write songs, except for the people whose songs I really liked. But there was no such thing in those days as a songwriting course or anything like that. If you wanted to make money out of songs, you had to write good ones. You couldn't go and teach it like you can now.
Of all the songs you wrote for Chisel, and there are so many, do you have a favourite?
No.
Really? They're like kids to you. You couldn't pick between them?
Yes, and like kids, there are good ones and there are bad ones.
But they're all your favourites.
No, I don't have favourites.
Well, he may not have been able to pick the one he likes best, but Don Walker was always keen to embody some sort of Australian experience in his songs. Most of his tunes say something about the country of his birth.
At that time, Australian experience was the only experience I had. So I wasn't really focused on things being Australian. I was just focused on writing things that resonated with us and with the people that we were playing to, which was a very small group of people then, and our experiences were all broadly some kind of thing. We're all the same age and doing the same things, so that's what you write about.
Were you surprised that they all became such big hits?
I have had very few big hits. There's a small list of Cold Chisel songs that are ongoing. You could call them sustainable.
You sure could.
That are ongoingly, meaningful to people. I guess I wrote about 50%, a little bit over 50% of those, because the other guys wrote hits too in the end. We shouldn't gloss over the fact that it took quite a few years for me to write anything that was acceptable to radio. So there was a long period where I wasn't writing anything useful in commercial terms.
Huh. Well, that's quite understandable, given the fact that you were a pub rock band for such a long time. I guess the aim wasn't on being commercial at all.
Well, in those days, all bands were pub rock bands. I don't think you can label Cold Chisel as a pub rock band unless you also label, I mean, INXS was a pub rock band, and so were the Go-Betweens. It just means that you're playing music in pubs, and that was the only place to play music, and unless you went into universities, and we went into universities as much as anybody.
Pub rock is a style of Australian rock and roll that peaked in popularity throughout the 70s and 80s. It's named after the live music circuit in which most associated bands developed their sound, inner city and suburban pubs. These were often noisy, hot, small and crowded venues that favoured loud, riff-based heavy rock. Australian pub rock emerged in the early 70s, with bands pioneering that sound by incorporating hard rock and blues rock and occasionally elements of progressive and psychedelic rock. It developed separately from British pub rock, with the Australian sound being heavier, bluesier and more hard-edged. Bands like AC/DC, Rose Tattoo and Cold Chisel expanded the sound further and all achieved mainstream success. In 81, Don, you also wrote and produced the soundtrack for the movie Freedom, which featured most of Cold Chisel and then also a very unknown singer, INXS's Michael Hutchence. What was that project like for you?
It was good. I'd always wanted to do a soundtrack because I liked soundtracks. I loved Dylan's soundtrack and still do, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. That's for that movie. And if you put that album on, that takes you straight into Texas and Mexico with very few tools. It's only really got about 3 songs on it, but they're gorgeous. And I loved that soundtrack, and also loved the soundtrack for the Giorgio Moroder soundtrack.
Oh, yes.
And which was completely different. That was an electronic soundtrack. So when I was approached by the South Australian Film Corporation, I had an idea. I really wanted to do a soundtrack, and this was my opportunity.
The movie Freedom had been about a loser of a young man blaming everyone for the fact that his dreams weren't coming true. The soundtrack was often hailed as the best rock music ever written for an Australian movie. Vocals were sung by the then unknown Michael Hutchence, who was singing out front of the pub rock band INXS. Could you tell from the get-go that Hutchence was going to be a big star?
Not directly. Myself and 1 or 2 other guys out of Cold Chisel were taken up to a little pub in Paddington by our girlfriends. And, you know, with the message of, you've really got to see this band. Right. And for us guys, you know, they're a good, competent band, and walked away, and the girlfriends are saying, no, you've really got to, because our management agency, Dirty Pool, they were looking around for younger generations of bands that we could take out on tour, and they could be the next bands coming up. And among those was, you know, the Divinals, INXS, a number of other bands. And the girlfriends were saying, this has to be one of these bands. And I'm saying, are you sure? Oh, yes, said the girlfriends, we're sure. What is it about them? And they're like shaking their heads saying, are you not looking at the singer? And yes, the bandwidths that INXS were connecting with was completely missing us. But there was no question that, you know, Michael was naturally, I never, it passed me by, but it wasn't passing most other people by.
Yeah, I hear you. With Cold Chisel, Don continued to write about everything he saw around him, including the things he witnessed during his time living in Sydney's King's Cross.
I didn't consciously. I mean, I don't walk around observing people. In fact, those people who know me would say that I was particularly unobservant. But, you know, if you're writing and you're in an environment, eventually that's going to leak in. You're going to start to smell that in the songs.
The band's popularity was growing, and Cold Chisel started drawing huge crowds all over Australia. Major international success, however, always eluded them, and it's still something that Don remains slightly disappointed about.
Oh, very much, but we didn't give it a serious try. I mean, we went to America once for 5 weeks. Nobody cracks America like that. We had more of a serious crack in Europe, and we were on our 3rd tour of Germany, and we had got to the stage where we were headlining in Germany in large clubs and pubs right through Germany, which was a big place for that kind of thing. So we were doing our own 50-day tour at the time that we broke up. America, we never even tried. We spent 5 weeks in America, and it was a debacle from one end to the other.
You were with Cold Chisel from 73 till 83 when the band disbanded. Why did that come to an end at that time?
We were exhausted. I had run out of gas a little bit in sort of figuring out where the next direction should lie. We were facing a big jump to international, and when you do that jump, it's hard yakka. And you've got to be prepared to go back to, very, very, very hard economics, touring in cars, a lot of hard work for long periods of time, and not in luxury.
Yeah, right.
And by that stage, we had enjoyed a year or two of success here. Everybody had gotten nice and comfortable here, and members of the band were settling into family life. So there was when we left Adelaide to conquer the country, there was just 5 of us in one car and not much petrol money. But for us to do that in America in 1983, we just didn't have the gas to do that anymore.
There was also a lot of turbulence within the group itself. Jimmy Barnes's relationship with the band was often volatile, and he left several times, leaving Ian Moss to handle vocal duties until he returned.
Those things happen. Jim wasn't the only one who was, leaving and coming back. Steve liked to do that too. That meant that you could never take it for granted if you were comfortable for a day. But, things worked out in the end, all right.
So was it at that time that you took a bit of a break from music and travelled around a bit?
I did. I thought, well, that was 10 years music, and that was good. That worked out well. Not as well as I had hoped. I thought Cold Chisel we had it in us to be a worldwide band. And maybe if we had come along 5 years later, that would have been it was a lot easier for bands who were trying to do that in the late 80s that were a bit younger than us.
In what way was it different?
It's just that the connections were more set up, and it was accepted by that stage that Australia was a source of music, and the younger bands could get over there and start hammering away at it a lot more quickly. By the time we got a record contract, we'd been traipsing around with no money for 5 years. With the younger bands, that didn't happen. By the time they came along, they could go from, like INXS, for example, they could go from forming, getting their stuff together, to having a record contract and be putting out records. They could do that in under 2 years.
Yeah, right. They're a bit ahead of your time.
Mm.
Between 1978 and 84, Cold Chisel had released 5 studio albums and won numerous awards. Don's songwriting credits include some of the band's biggest and most iconic singles. Among them, 1984's Saturday Night, 1980's Girl and Cheap Wine, and 1978's K-San, which in 2001 made the top 10 in a poll of the greatest Australian songs of all time. After Cold Chisel disbanded, Don formed Catfish, an ensemble of backing musicians with him as frontman and songwriter. Catfish released 2 critically acclaimed but commercially unsuccessful albums, and Don's writing became even more Australian.
Well, initially, the first Catfish album, I had been travelling through Eurasia, and so the first Catfish album is it's very un-Australian. There's a lot of Russian and Eastern European stories in there. And then after I'd been back in Australia for a little while, the second Catfish album came out, and that's very Australian.
Right. If we come up to 1998, you were back with Cold Chisel and releasing the first studio album that they'd done for 15 years, it called The Last Wave of Summer. How come? How'd you come back together again?
I was reluctant because we had broken up in 1983 and we had driven the car as far as it would go, and the wheels were off, and I swore to everybody else, if we're going to break this up, this is serious. We're not taking a break. We're smashing the crockery, and there's no going back. And there had been the idea of getting back together had come up from time to time, but I was adamant that no, when you break up, you break up. But I guess what changed my mind and softened me up was firstly a set of songs that Steve Prestwich had written, which were extraordinary songs. And then Jim was living in France at the time with his family, and he was working on new material too, and he sent a new set of songs over. And Jim's songs were really advanced. I mean, they were really sophisticated, really good stuff, different to Steve's. And I was drawn in by those two sets of songs. The fact that no matter where you go, Jim and Ian are still the two best singers that you could possibly work with. Person by person in Cold Chisel, they're the best people anywhere.
Cold Chisel had reunited in 1997. They recorded their sixth studio album and supported it with a national tour. The album debuted at #1.
It's kind of seductive, the idea of taking songs into that group of people into a studio with the extra 15 years of things that I had learned.
That's also around the time when Don's association with the great Slim Dusty began.
Yes.
Slim Dusty, who was born David Kirkpatrick, was an Australian country music singer, songwriter, guitarist and producer. He was an Aussie cultural icon, referred to universally as Australia's king of country music. He was also one of the country's most awarded stars, with a career spanning nearly 7 decades. He was the first Australian to have a #1 international hit song, with his version of Gordon Parsons' A Pub With No Beer.
I had had some success in conjunction with Graham Connors, pitching songs into Slim. And I think it was Graham that first got me to co-write in the country music way. I mean, I had co-written with other guys in Cold Chisel, but that was always like, I'll write some music to your lyrics, or you write music to mine, or whatever. But this was with Graham Connors. He frog marched me into a room and sat down and said, oh, we are going to write a song because Slim is looking for songs and this is what we're going to write about. And we wrote a song together and pitched it in, and Slim did it. And the reason that Slim did that song, which was called High, Dry and Homeless, was because Graham had pitched it in, and Graham was one of his known and trusted, personally. He's a country guy, solid, blue chip. I don't know that Slim would have had much idea of who I was.
Right. But that's not where your association ended with Slim Dusty, was it?
No, we did a few more of them. I wrote a couple of songs in Nashville a year or two later, and Slim did them. Then there was a Catfish song, Charleville, that Slim did, and I'm told that was initiated by Joy, Slim's wife, found it on a cassette on the floor of the car, and they heard it, and Joy said, well, I think you need to do that, Slim. And the next thing, he had done a version, and they rang me up and said, we would like to do a duet with you. Would you be up for doing a duet with Slim? So that was in the course of doing that. That's where Slim and I first met.
Right. I'm getting a common theme happening here, that it's the women that make things happen.
Yes, how right you are.
Don Walker, in 1994, you recorded your first solo album, having been with Tex, Don and Charlie, a trio, in years preceding that. Why did you decide to go solo?
Well, I guess the Catfish albums were solo albums in a way, but without me having the courage or being completely comfortable with putting my name out there on them and my face. But I guess the first solo album, which was called We're All Gonna Die, that's the first one that I heard it and I thought, this is really what I want to be, the music that I want to make. And it's interesting that the albums that I make now sound a lot like that, even though apart from one person, all the personnel playing on it are different.
Going solo, did that require a bit of shift of mindset, an increase in confidence? What sort of adjustments did you have to make to your being to put yourself out there front and centre and be there on your own?
It was generated really by the experience of working with Tex and Charlie. And recording had been with Cold Chisel and more with even more with Catfish had been long and laborious and getting details perfect and everything like that. Tex and Charlie had the confidence to walk into a studio and record songs as you play live. We're now in the studio, we're playing music together. What we're doing now, it will be going on the record. That mindset. And we have the confidence that we can do that because we are professional musicians in our middle age and we know what the blue F we are doing. That experience of making a very good record with Tex and Charlie and watching them work and working with the people that they worked with, it was such a liberating experience. I thought, well, I'm going to make records like that. I had my own people that I wanted to do that with. It's fun to walk into a studio with a bunch of gun guys and women, if it happens to be women, and walk out of the studio after 10 hours and there are 4 songs on tape.
To date, Don Walker has released 5 solo albums, the latest of which is Live Lightning, a 10-track live album recorded on his recent solo dates around Australia. You kept on writing. You wrote a whole lot of songs for a bunch of different Australian artists. In 2005, you, Tex and Charlie again recorded and released the widely acclaimed All Is Forgiven, which was your first album together in 12 years. So your edict about breaking up and never getting back together again was smashed, wasn't it? You did keep going back to places you'd been before to a great result. Well, did you have that same attitude with women? Once it's over, it's over? Did you end up going back to relationships in the same way?
No, bands are different to women.
We'll leave it at that. Anyway, you had lots of success with Tex and Charlie one more time in 2005, and you published your own book in 2009. So then now you're a published author, same as your sister and your mother. That must have felt good.
Yeah, what felt good was that my sister and my mother liked it. My father was he read the book and he looked at me. His comment was, you don't talk like that. So, yes, I was approached by a publisher who is now a good friend. It was actually after a Tex, Don and Charlie concert in 2005, which he and his friends had really enjoyed. And I was approached and he said, do you have a book? I said, no way. That's not the kind of writer I am. But then
you rose to the challenge.
Later, I released one through his publishing company.
And it's a great book. It's called Shots.
That's right.
Well worth a read. Moving forward again, Cold Chisel wrapped the 2011 Light the Nitro tour. That was the largest tour ever by an Aussie band or artist and released No Plans. You released your incredible third solo album called Hully Gully, and a song from that, The Perfect Crime, became the title song for the Cold Chisel album of the same name in 2015.
Yes.
You must have been chuffed.
The songs that I have done on my solo albums do have a habit of turning up. Not many of them, but occasionally they turn up on a Cold Chisel album later, which is good.
Sadly, the original lineup of Cold Chisel can be no more. Founding bass guitarist Les Kaczmarek died of liver failure in 2008 at the age of 53. In 2011, Steve Prestwich was diagnosed with a brain tumour. He underwent surgery but never regained consciousness and died 2 days later at the age of 56. Jimmy Barnes, as we all know, went on to achieve global success on his own, as did Ian Moss. Don Walker continues to write and collaborate with some of the best-known names in Australian music: pop, rock, country, indie and folk. Artists like Missy Higgins, Kate Ceberano, Jimmy Little, Troy Cassar-Daley and Sarah Blasco, as well as Moss and Barnes. Don now has 2 books to his name. The first we've already discussed, called Shots, the second from 2019 called Songs. Among his industry awards are an aria for Tucker's Daughter, which he co-wrote with Ian Moss. Tucker's Daughter was voted Song of the Year in 1990. Don has 3 APRAs, including the Ted Albert Award for Outstanding Services to Australian Music, which was awarded to Cold Chisel in 2016. He was inducted into the Australian Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2012, and in 2020, the University of New England awarded him an honorary doctorate. He says there's still plenty more to come from him.
Hopefully, yes. There's not as much time left as there used to be, but fingers crossed.
Indeed. Thank you so much for sharing your time and stories with us. It's an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Don. All the best now. Bye.
Bye.